Have you been stretching your hip flexors before a run, after a run, but still experience tight groin after a long run? Here's what I mean. When your hip flexor feel tight, that familiar pull at the front of your hip, maybe a bit of stiffness first thing in the morning or after a long run, the instinct is to stretch. And that instinct makes completely sense. It's logical. If something feels tight, you loosen it. But there's a problem with that logic, because what feels like tightness in your hip flexors is often weakness in disguise. And if you spend your time stretching a tendon that's actually weak, you're not solving the problem. Today I want to walk you through what's actually going on with hip flexor in runners, the biology, the dysfunctions, and why so many people are treating the symptoms instead of the cause. By the end, you understand what your hip flexors are actually doing when you run, why the classic approach fails, and what you need to do differently to actually feel and run better. Let's break this down. First, let's get clear on what we are actually talking about. The hip flexors are not one muscle, they are a group. The main ones you need to know: the psoas, which is a deep one, running from the lower spine to the top of your femur, and the iliacus, which sits inside the pelvis and joins the psoas at the hip. Together, they are called the iliopsoas. That's a big one. Then you got the rectus femoris, part of your quads, but also a hip flexor, and the tensum fasciae latae, or TFL, which connects down into your IT band. Understanding those connections becomes important in the moment. So what do they actually do during running? Think of a leg as a pendulum. With every stride, one leg pushes back, the other swings forwards. The hip flexors are the engine that drives that forward swing. They fire in what we call the pre-swing and early swing phase, that moment when your foot leaves the ground and your knee drives forward. They're essentially pulling your leg through. And here's the thing most people don't appreciate: this isn't a gentle job. Research in the Journal of Orthopedics and Sport Physical Therapy look at the forces going through the hip muscles during running at different step rates. The psoas and iliacus are producing significant force during that swing phase. They're working hard repeatedly, thousands of times on every run. And the faster you run, the harder they work. So when this system isn't functioning properly, when the hip flexors are weak or poorly timed or not coordinating well with the glutes and the core, your whole running economy takes a stride. A study published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research found that runners who completed an 8-week hip flexor strengthening program improved their sprint times by nearly 4% and the shuttle run times by 9%. Just from the training the hip flexor. That's not a small number. Now here's where this becomes relevant. Because if these muscles are so important, why do so many runners feel like their groin are constantly tight and underperforming? The answer is how we live in our modern lifestyle. Many runners spend 50 to 75% of their day sitting down. Think about it, you might train an hour a day, but you are sitting for 8 to 9 or 10 hours. When you sit, your hips are in constant flexion. The hip flexors are shortened. And over time, your nervous system starts to register that short-term position as the neutral or new normal. The glutes, the main hip extensors, go quiet, what we call reciprocal inhibitions. When one muscle group is constantly shortened and overactive, the opposing group switches off. Now you've got a runner with overworked, chronically shortened hip flexors and underactive glutes. That combination creates what feels like tightness. But the real issue is, it's a strength and control problem, not just a flexibility problem. And this is where the standard advice goes wrong. Why stretching isn't enough? Because I don't want to go too hard on stretching. Stretching has a place, but here's the problem with relying on it to fix the hip flexor issues. There's a really important distinction that most people miss. Flexibility is passive. It's how far a muscle can be moved when an external force, for instance when you apply force with your hands. Mobility is active. It's how far you can move a joint under your own control. And when you run, everything is active. You don't have someone holding your hip in position. Your nervous system is firing, your muscles are contracting, your body is managing dynamic forces with every single stride. So here's the part that changes how you think about this. Research has shown that increasing passive flexibility doesn't automatically improve how you use that range during movement. In other words, you can stretch your hip flexors every day and get more flexible on the table test, But when you go for a run, your stride doesn't get longer. What actually drives the length and efficiency of your stride is not how long the muscle is passively. It's how well you can control your hip extension while simultaneously driving your knee forwards on the other side. That requires strength, specifically eccentric strength, the ability of the hip flexor to control and decelerate the leg as it swings back, and then accelerate it forward again. This is a stretch shortening movement. Your hip flexor loads eccentrically in late swing as your leg extends behind you, then fires concentrically to drive the knee forward. If that muscle is weak, it can't do the job properly. And what does your body do when it can't do the job properly? It compensates. This is what I see in clinic all the time. A runner comes with knee pain or IT band syndrome or lower back pain after long runs. We do a gait assessment and notice the hip isn't extending properly. The glutes are not firing well. The pelvis is tilting forward. There's a connection. And what's the connection? The TFL. The tensor fasciolator I mentioned earlier is a hip flexor, but it also fits directly into the IT band. When the deep hip flexor are not doing their job, the TFL often takes over. It becomes overactive, and that increased tension travels down into the IT band. So what looks like an IT band problem is often, at least in part, a hip flexor control problem. Same story with lower back pain. When the psoas is weak or poorly controlled, it changes the position of the pelvis and your lumbar spine. You get what's called anterior pelvic tilt, that exaggerated curve in the lower back. And over months of running, the posture puts cumulative load on structures that were not designed to take it. A systemic review identified restricted hip flexor function as one of the most common risk factors for lower back pain in runners. The hip is in the middle of the chain. What happens there affects everything above and below. Which is why some people might say, when something hurts in a runner, always look at the hip. So what you should actually do? Let me walk you through a proper approach, not a random list of exercises. A progression that makes sense for how this tissue works. Stage 1. Address the position first. Before you can strengthen the hip flexors effectively, you need to get the pelvis in a better position. So the first step is learning to find and hold a neutral pelvis. A simple way to practice this is lie on your back, knees bent. Now flatten your lower back gently against the floor by activating a deep core or gently drawing in your lower abdomen. You want to be able to find that position and maintain it under load. Dead bugs are excellent for this. You're teaching the core to stabilize the pelvis while the limbs move, exactly what happens during running. Stage 2. Introduce hip flexor loading. Once you have some pelvic control, you can start loading the hip flexor properly. Start with slow, controlled leg raises and progress to standing bended hip flexion. Stage 3. Integrate into movement. This is where the real gains happen. High knees train the hip flexor in a running specific pattern. A-skips, if you've never done this, they are running drill that isolates exactly what hip flexors do in the early swing phase. And then other single leg workouts such as split squats, step up, single leg RDL. These build glute strength, which is the other half of the equation. Strong glutes reduce the compensatory load on the hip flexors. The whole system starts to work together. What about stretching? I'm not saying never stretch. If your hip flexors are genuinely limited in their passive range, some stretching is appropriate. But think of stretching as preparation. A 60-second hip flexor stretch before a run, that's fine. It helps open up the position. But if all you're doing is just stretching and never loading, you're maintaining a problem by not solving it. The tissue needs to be loaded to get stronger. That's how adaptation works. To come back to something I mentioned earlier, that study showing nearly 4% improvement in sprint times and 9% improvement in shuttle run times just from 8 weeks of hip flexor training. What does that mean for a runner? Running economy, how efficiently your body moves at a given pace, is one of the strongest predictors of performance. More efficient runners can go further, faster for less metabolic costs. The hip flexors contribute directly to running economy. Research from a study of recreationally trained endurance runners found that the strength balance ratio between hip flexors and extensors was significantly associated with running economy in male runners. What that means in plain English, it's not just about how strong your hip flexors are in isolation, but how well they work in balance with your glutes and hamstring. When the system is balanced, when the hip flexors are strong, the glutes are strong, the pelvis is stable, your legs move like an efficient pendulum. When it's out of balance, hip flexors tight and overwork, glutes switch off, stride gets shorter, your pelvis bounces, and your body wastes energy. And you slow down, even without getting injured. This is why I think hip flexor training is one of the most under-prescribed interventions in recreational running. Not because it's complicated, but because it's boring. Because no one talks about it in the context of performance. Core stability gets lots of attention, but the muscle that actually drives your leg forward on every single stride often gets ignored. So let's bring this together. Your hip flexors are not just the muscle at the front of your hip, they are part of the complex system, connected to your pelvis, your spine, your IT band and your knee. What feels like tightness is often weakness, and stretching a weak muscle doesn't make it stronger. The approach that actually works is to stabilize the pelvis first, then load the hip flexors progressively, and ultimately integrate the strength into running specific movement patterns. It doesn't take long, 2 or 3 sessions a week, 8 weeks of focused work. And if you found this helpful, there's a video on glute activation for runners that connects directly with everything we've covered today. I'll link it here. And if you're dealing with a specific hip or running injury, drop it in the comments. I read them and it helps me know what to cover next. Thank you.